I've wanted to build the Nostromo for a long time. Alien is one of my all-time favorite films, so making a model of the Nostromo just seemed right. The challenge isn't only the size and amount of parts, but I'll be adding a ton of greeblies, LEDs, fiber optics, and custom-made parts to make the model look like in the movie. Welcome to the Geeky Workbench. I found the STL files on Gambody by an artist called Leo Martel. The model is very detailed and you can print it just the way it is and everybody would instantly recognize it as the Nostromo. But if you know me, you know I love details, a lot. So I used Alien, the Blueprints by Graham J. Langridge for reference. It has great depictions of vehicles and buildings from Alien 1 to 4 and also Prometheus and Covenant. And I also used a YouTube video by The Prop Store for details I could add to make this model look more like in the movie. I'll add all links and resources in the description. My goal is not 100% film accurate, but to come as close as I can with the materials I have. Once all the parts were printed, I could start taking off all the supports, which went much easier than on my Prometheus rover project because I've learned a few things since then and I changed a few printer settings. Also, the pieces came out much finer with less layer lines, which is also great. Now that all the parts are ready, I can start the sub-assembly. I am following the instructions for the most part, but things like the antennas and clear parts I'm not adding yet. The antennas would only break off while handling the model, so I'm leaving those for last and painting them separately. Here I'm test fitting and gluing the frontal section. Most parts need a bit of sanding before going together, but I won't show you that every time. For the rest of the video I'll focus mostly on the extra details, custom parts, lighting, and any issues I came across. Most parts have connectors which I glued together with CA glue. The connectors have a pretty tight fit, so a little extra force was needed. I glued in the docking tube, but not the front antenna, because that looked like a part that I would definitely break off long before the painting stage. The left part was printed in 2 halves, hence the filled seam line, in case you were wondering. This section has a minor flaw because the small part is missing 2 holes, which you need for wiring if you're going to add LEDs. But that is easily fixed. I just made the 2 holes with a rotary tool. They're not pretty, but nobody will see. Well, except you, of course. Now I can feed the wires through here to the bridge and front hull lights. The docking module went together without any issues. I sanded the main parts and glued them together with CA glue and the connectors. The thrusters of the docking module were going to have LEDs and the holes seemed quite small, so I used a pin vise to drill them open a bit to get more of the light shining through. The top of the docking hatch looked a bit rough from printing, so I filed and sanded the area. You can see the difference here quite well. These big parts are half of the main ship. After sanding and gluing them together, there was a little seam line. I used grey putty to fill those gaps as good as I could without covering any of the surface details. The center engine bell has a lot of parts and they went together very well. The only issue I had was that some of the little tabs on the flaps broke off, but I'll get to those flaps again later. Next were the two wing parts. The big opening is for the landing gear and the hole on the side is a tunnel for wiring, which I'll also be using later. Once the wing box and flaps were attached, I set the wings aside and turned to the landing gear. The landing gear is designed to be functional. When the legs move inwards, the cover's shut, and vice versa. But for some reason, the arm of the cover didn't fit the groove, so I had to sand it down quite a bit. But by the time it fit, I had come to the decision that I wanted the legs to be permanently fixed in place. So I glued the landing gear covers in open position. I wasn't sure 3 of these little legs held by a bit of glue would manage to hold the quite heavy ship, so I used some spare legs as counterparts that would prevent the main legs from just collapsing inwards. The windows for the bridge were printed in clear resin, but for all the round covers of the engines I used transparent sheet PETG. I measured all the pieces and prepared the templates in Adobe Illustrator and then cut the parts on my Cricut. I set the clear parts aside until the very last moment of the build, so they wouldn't be painted over. Then it was time to add LEDs. First I prepared some 3mm white LEDs with resistors and wires for the front hull section and bridge. With the help of tweezers, the wires went through the tunnels quite well. Gluing these parts together was a little tricky because of the wires, but gluing first and then add LEDs later would have been more difficult because of the bend of the wire tunnel. The LEDs for the docking module would flop around inside, which could affect the evenness of the light, so I decided to quickly design a tube that would keep the LEDs centered and in place. Once the LEDs and tubes were glued in place, I could finish assembling the docking module. The other engines are quite big, so I decided to use LED strips instead of multiple regular LEDs. And I also needed a way to attach the strips and keep them in place inside the engine. So I designed custom tubes for those as well. The tubes fit well inside the engines, but I will have to make the center tube a bit shorter. You'll see later in the video. I decided to add some aluminium tape to help reflect more of the light. Once I had the LED strips wired up, I glued them into the tubes. The strips are laid out for 12 volts, but I'm using 9 volts, which seems to be bright enough. Then I added the tubes to the wings, but didn't glue them in just yet. Here's the center tube, which I had to cut a piece off of so it would fit. And this is all still just dry fitting and not gluing, because there are a few things we have to get done first. For these LEDs, I also designed tubes that fit inside the two smaller engines next to the center one. Another lighting test, and now all the LEDs are installed and the main parts are sub-assembled. Next comes the fun part, adding all the extra details in Greebllies. This model has a lot of great detail already, and you could totally print it as it is, but if you look closer, there are a few areas that are lacking details. Here there are just a few panels where there should be all sorts of widgets. I wish I could replicate every single Greebly like this one on the original filming prop, but that's just not possible because I don't have the parts or resources. But I will do my best to add as many widgets and Greebllies as I possibly can. Let's find some widgets. This looks much better. These engines are a little bit too plain and too symmetrical for me. So first I went to Tinkercad and recreated the Greebllies for inside the bell and printed them with resin. I glued them in place with CA glue and added some tiny styrene rod pieces as well. And I think this turned out great when you compare it to the original prop. After I had started adding Greebllies to the outside, I realized that the Greebllies wouldn't be enough for the whole ship. So I went back to Tinkercad and used Greebllies I had bought on Cults 3D to create my own Greeblly blocks by combining various pieces together. I printed those on my resin printer as well. Then I glued the Greeblly blocks to the engines. Next was the docking hatch. It looks okay, but if you compare it to the blueprints, you'll see that we can do a little something here too. So first I cut off everything I didn't want and then added all the details I wanted with styrene. Yes, I like this very much. For this model I'm trying fiber optics for the first time. This is what I've learned how to install them. You only need your fiber optic cable, dark tubing and a light source like an LED. The round top is best sanded down so that you have a flat surface and the light spreads equally to all fiber optic cables. Then you gather your fiber optics, and the number you can attach to your LED depends on the size of the LED and the diameter of your cables. With a dark tube you connect the cables to the LED, and that's it. The end of the fiber optics now glow in the color of your LED. Before I install the fiber optics, I need to finish up the wiring. This LED will give a bit of light to the landing gear. It's very subtle, but since the tunnel was already there, I'm using it. Now the holes I made earlier can serve their purpose. The last piece of the front hull won't get any connectors because then I couldn't slide the piece in, and it's a tight enough fit anyway. I filled the gaps with grey putty, and now it's time to drill some holes for the fiber optics. Since this isn't a hollow model kit but a 3D print that isn't hollow, I have to choose the spots for the fiber optics wisely, otherwise I'll have no way of getting the cable to the center where all wires connect. I drilled the holes in areas where there are tunnels to feed the cables through. And I made sure to leave a few centimeters sticking out, and then glued it in place with a 2-part epoxy glue. Now that all LEDs and fiber optics are installed, it's time to assemble the main parts. You can see on the two halves of the main chip that I carved out an opening. This is to have more room for all the cables and wires and the battery. The trickiest part here was not to get the fiber optics pinched between the two halves. I felt a bit like a surgeon as I was fiddling all the wires through, and it took much longer than this short sequence makes it look. Finally, it's coming together. And here I could have made it easier for myself if I hadn't glued the docking module on yet, because instead of sorting the wiring out down here and have space in the docking module for the battery, I had to do all the soldering and connecting in the docking module, and that made the space very tight. But I managed with a bit of sweating and swearing. You'll see in a minute. I glued the landing legs into the wings and then the wings to the ship. This is the complete ship, just without the 3 big engines, and this is the wiring done and dusted. I created these pipes or tubes in Tinkercad with the help of the blueprints and printed them with my FDM printer. I did the same for the missing pipes on the sides. But for these I also needed some extra details, which I made by hand. And then I glued them all in place. Now I can finally start adding panels and greeblies to the rest of the ship. This took ages, and it's just the first pass. As I was checking pictures in between, I realized that the flaps were the wrong way around. I followed the instructions, but in the original prop they're the other way around, so I paused the greeblying and broke off all the flaps, turned them around and glued them back on. And that's when I noticed that the flaps on the other two engines needed some attention too. I cut them all off and designed new ones in Tinkercad, printed them and glued them on. Then I noticed some struts were missing too. I couldn't make them in Tinkercad, so I made them by hand with styrene. One of you asked about the Narcissus, and here she is. She's part of the model and I printed her in resin. The instructions say to simply glue her to the exterior, but we're not doing that. In Tinkercad I designed a little housing for her. And of course I printed two, because there is one for the second lifeboat shuttle, the Salmacis, but that shuttle wasn't there at the time, so I'm leaving that empty. After that was done, I could go back and finish the Greebllies. But then I noticed a few other parts that weren't there, so I designed them as well. I'm still new to Tinkercad, but this project gave me a lot of practice. I glued these parts to the rear of the docking module. I have added all the custom-made parts I could make and glued on lots of extra Greebllies. Now she is ready for priming. I primed the model with a grey primer by Army Painter. And since my spray booth is too small for the ship, I turned my other bench into a painting station. First I laid down a base coat of sky grey, and I tried purposefully to not cover everything evenly to give the ship its rough and used look. I sprayed a second coat and painted the engine insides and wing boxes black. Then followed a thinned down coat of grimy grey. I created these stencils in Adobe Illustrator and cut them with my Cricut. And I wasn't sure the stencil would work so well because there were so many tiny parts, but it worked out really well. I covered everything in a gloss varnish before I started adding the oil washes. Because some areas had gotten a bit too dark, I went over the whole model again with a light grey dry brushing. Last thing to do is snip off the fiber optics, add the antennas and the windows for the bridge. Oh yes, and the clear covers we made at the beginning. This is the USCSS Nostromo, and I have to say, this one tested me. Over 200 printed parts, weeks of scratch building and adding detail by hand, LEDs wired through the entire hull, and endless zooming in on reference pictures. What started as boxes of plastic parts is now this, and I couldn't be happier how she turned out. Thanks for following along with this build. If it inspired you to start your own, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. See you in the next one. It might be alien related too.